Okay, hi everyone. So till now we have completed two sessions. The first was the basic architecture and walkthrough for different like best practices to do the to cover while developing a microservice, and we covered the liquid base, how database migration scripts can be executed along with when the server is spinning up, how that maintains the log. We saw the map struct wherein you can convert models to DTOs, and then we moved on to Spring Data wherein we saw various different kind of entity mapping, one to one, one to many, many to one, and then we saw ways to communicate with the database. Different ways. One was with the entity manager, another was the inbuilt one with the Spring Data, which was by method name, then native query, how you can write a native query within that just top of the method name in an interface, repository interface. Calling a store proc, we wrote a small store proc and called the that store proc into our application, and we were able to render that. So in a way, we have covered in last two sessions what is supposed to be covered as part of microservice, including the best practices. In this session, we'll pick the security part, wherein the it's a most important part, but it is least given importance, or I can say it is given importance at the later stage. Only reason being it is not so visible on the screen maybe, or not feasible enough for most of the developer. It's a one-time activity, but it's very important for an application to be present. So we'll start off with Spring security, adding the Spring security, and I'm sharing my screen. So adding a Spring security over there, and then we'll create an authentication application, because authentication is the backbone of every application. So we'll use Spring security feature wherein we can leverage the authentication mechanism rather than writing a business logic over there. And then we'll integrate the JWT token, which is a JSON Web Token, JWT, wherein you can use that token, and we'll see what are the benefits of using JWT token over there. And I'll give you a brief architecture about the OAuth, the way it works, and then we'll try to integrate our application, uh, wherein we can authenticate or register our application, like register the user via GitHub or Facebook. A lot to cover. So unlike last time, I have done some bit of coding so that I can talk more and write less. So yeah, I'll be doing a little bit of coding hands-on right now, but most of the things I will be covering, which is already pushed. So I've created a small microservice which is a login service right now. What I have done is, let's say we have to integrate Spring security. Suppose we want to create an authentication mechanism. So the what we have done is we have added a Spring security uh, dependency into our application, and as soon as we have added that dependency, Spring just kicks off by just integrating the like allowing the user only by authenticating them. Only if only an authenticated user can access the resource which is available in our microservice. So to get that, what I've done is I've created a small endpoint, uh, let's say this one, which is just home, user, and admin. Just three endpoints. We'll come to roles because I've kept different roles, which is user and admin. But for now, we'll just authenticate and see how that works. So by default, what happens is once we add the dependency, which is the Spring security, it the security just kicks in, and it will ask for credential whenever you try to log in. So for instance, if I'm trying to access the endpoint, which is okay. By the way, I have added a context path. As you can see, the context path is auth. So with the host, you need to add the context path, which is auth. So it will ask for this sign in form. So this sign in form is not developed by me, it is by default by Spring security. By default it comes up, which if we don't have any kind of mechanism, so it gives us this form. So what will be the username and password? So by default, if you see in the logs over here, there's a default password which has been spit out by the server. We can use that credential. So by default, the default user name is the user, and the password is the one which has been spit out over here. So this gives the homepage. And if I want to access any of the endpoints, let's say admin, so we can get the response, which is admin, which is coming from here. This looks good, but every time this passwords will change. And if you want to kickstart, there would be different modules. Two developers will be working on, let's say, the login and authentication authorization module, and some of the developers will be working on the actual business microservices. So to get started, we can just provide with one of the credentials. The way to do that is, there are two different ways. Either you can use the in-memory database, in-memory authentication mechanism, or you can just write it in the property file. It is not a production recommended way, but to kickstart it is good that if we have this properties, let's say Spring security user, the these are the two properties, that's a name and password. If we keep this and spin this up, so next time it won't be having this password in the server log, and we can use this credential to log in into our application every time. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so there's one other thing. Since I'm already logged in, I'll come to the session part. Why I'm still logged in, because there's some session ID in old servlet. So Spring is a framework, and beneath that, what there we are using is J2E. So in this J2E, there's something called as session management, which keeps spits out session ID, which browser maintains that. And if that is gone, then the user has to re-log in. So for now, one of the endpoint which has been given by Spring Security by default is just logout. That is /logout. If you append it to your context path, you will be logged out by default, and you can use the new credential now, which has been set up. Oops. Okay. Okay, yeah. So this is all fine. And this is a good way to kickstart your login module. But let's say if you want to keep multiple users, let's say if you have some role-based business logic to be implemented in your application, there's no way you can keep multiple usernames over here. So what the another way is, I'll just comment this out. There's another way which you can do it, which is via adding, I'll just uncomment this by using the in-memory database. We'll connect this to a MySQL database as well, but for now, I'll just quickly show you how do you do that. So to do that, what you need to do is you need to create a configuration class wherein you will specify that you want to enable the web security, and you need to extend a class that's an abstract class, which is essentially web security configurer adapter. And from there are different methods which it shows. If I can just show that. So these are the different methods, and most of them will be using this in this today's session. The one which is important right now is the authentication manager. Authentication manager, as the name suggests, which manages the authentication, which we need to provide the authentication, like what's the way you want to authenticate the user. So we here what one other approach is, if you want to keep multiple users during development phase, what you can do is there's a different mechanism wherein you can have the JDBC authentication, you will have the LDAP authentication. I'll use the in-memory authentication for now. So in memory authentication with user, let's say the same Rohit, password as 123, and I'll give one role over here, which will be, I'll come back to this because we'll if there is any kind of RBAC in our microservice. RBAC is nothing but a role-based access control. So if we have any such kind of feature, so we can use the use that feature which has been provided by Spring Security. So for now, I'll just say this is the role as user, and this uses the builder pattern, so you can have the methods chaining over here. So, and with again one more user, let's say John, password is same 123456, and role as admin. Okay, now this is fine. So once I spin this up, it will be having two users in memory, and you can use these users to log in uh, into to while accessing the endpoints. Uh, by default, earlier Spring was allowing plain passwords to be stored. While I'm storing this into the MySQL database as well, it has to be encoded now. So if I spin this up, it will fail because Spring will try to decode this password with a default password encoder. So if I have this bean over here, which is password encoder, what basically does is we can choose what kind of password encoding mechanism we want to go, MD5 or SHA-1, SHA-256, or the default, which is the bcrypt. We'll use the default one for now. So to use that, uh, I can't inject this bean within that same bean. So because I'm overriding this method, so what I can do is I'll just encode this while I'm storing in memory. So encode, which is this one, and same goes with this password as well. Okay, no, sorry, dot encode. Okay, so this looks good, and we have two users now, which the two users will be created in memory, but we want some kind of role mechanism for our different endpoints. So for instance, as I said in my test resource, I want this user, this endpoint to be accessed only by user who is having a role as user, and admin, which is the user which is having role as admin. So to do that, what we can do is I'll need to override another method, which is the HTTP security, configure HTTP security. So over here, what you'll do is authorize request. I want to authorize all the requests, and I'll add some ANT matchers here. ANT matchers are basically wherein you can specify your endpoints, which endpoints needs to be authenticated for which role. So for instance, for me, it's, let me just check. Uh, so this one's, I'll just keep. So this one, I have home, user, and admin. So user is with the role as user. So I'll say the one with that one has role user, because I have kept the role as user over here. So this one, and matcher again, I'll say admin has role admin. And the last one is for all, which is star star, anything followed, I'll say permit. I don't want this to be authenticated. Uh, so these requests should be authorized, and this will be permitted. Like, or you can say to say if I don't want any role, so has, okay, I'll just skip that. I'll say permit all. Okay. this looks good. Okay, so when I spin this up, you will be having two users, and when I try to access any of the users, so that role should be properly configured, and it will be given access. Let's try that. Okay. Okay. So yeah, uh, I'm not sure with what user I had last logged in. So I'm trying to access the admin. It is given me 403. So what I'll do is, I don't know which user I logged in last. I think it was Rohit. Yeah. So I was logged in as Rohit, and I was having a role as user, and I'm trying to access the admin endpoint, which is giving me 403. I'll just log out from here, and which is giving me some permit all. One sec, I'll just. So here's one thing. While I'm talking, I can cover this one as well. Uh, one sec, sorry. So once we log in, what Spring does is it maintains the J session ID. This J session ID is basically, it's been given by server to understand the request where it has been originated. It should come back to that same instance, so that it is aware that it has already been authenticated. So let me just remove that and refresh it, and don't know. I'll just restart once. I think this has got something to do with this one. I've just permitted all. Okay, I can do one thing. I'll just open in the incognito mode. I don't want to restart it again. I think I'll just remove this one sec. Uh, okay, not sure what I'm messing up over here, but it's not allowing me to log out. But yeah, definitely, I need to add that and match her wherein it will invalidate the session, and it will maintain that. So basically, you can use the in-memory database this way and have the rules assigned to different endpoints. Now this is fine. Now what we'll do is we'll move on and integrate this with the MySQL database, wherein we have bunch of users. Let's say we have millions of users wherein you want to actually authenticate, where you want to make this production ready. So what we can do here is that we can uh, have the database connected, wherein you can read the users from the database. So to do that, I'll just revert this code for now. Okay, and so here's the thing. Uh, so we can use, there are different, as I said, authentication managers which manages the authentication, wherein you can specify different providers. Here you have what we are going to use is user detail service thing. Like what this does is we have the control over to provide the Spring security with the user which needs to be authenticated. There's a specific model that needs to be created and given to Spring security so that it can authenticate the user. So to do that, what I'll do is I'll just uncomment few of the things. Like I have already created a login user detail service. Don't need the filter for now. Okay, so to do that, I have login user detail service. So I'll just uncomment this, and we should implement the user detail service, which is part of Spring security. Hello, any questions, anyone? I can hear. Okay. uh, that's the user detail service, wherein I'll have my own service communicating with the database via repository, but there's one specific method where the Spring security requires. So what we can do is we need to load the user by name and then give it back, and that specific model is this one, which is actually part of Spring security. So it wants this model to be populated from our database. So just imagine, like, if our database will have the user info with n number of columns, let's say date of birth, blah blah, let's say um, password reset, days left. Just imagine, like, whatever business logic will be there, but you can have as many as you like, but Spring wants in specifically this format. So what I've done is this user, we will fetch it from the database via repository, for which I have created a user auth repository, and user auth is our model right now. And in Liquibase, what I have done is I have added a script which will be executed to create this user auth table. So basically it's ID, username, password, roles. Role is in varchar, so comma separated basically, which I'll show you, which we can convert it into the string. And yeah, so I'll just change the primary key so that it can recreate this table. I have, okay, there's one other thing. Import, okay, import was missing. Okay, so coming back to over here, uh, so that's the load user by name, which we need to override, and from repository we are getting that username, user from that username, or else we'll throw user not found exception. And once we have this db user, what I've done is I've created this uh, login user detail model, which actually implements the user details, which is part of Spring security. So once I'm implementing this, I've got a bunch of methods which I need to override, which is basically all the username, password, which I need to set. So what I've done is I've created this parameterized constructor, taking the model object and converting that into this username password, and whatever values are there in the database, it has been set over here. And roles, it's basically the comma separated. I have converted that into simple granted authority. That's the way the rules have been identified in Spring Security. So uh, as you can understand, we got the user from the database, and from that user, what I've done is I've created the login user details, which eventually gives me an object which is of type user details, from where it can get all this information which it requires to uh, authenticate the user. So this bit is clear. Now my authentication manager is hooked up with the login user detail service, and yeah, so basically it should work now if we try and spin this up. And again, the password encoder, I guess the password encoder. Okay, for the password encoder thing, what I've done is for local data populator, that's the one which I've created. So I'll just uncomment this. It's a component, and I'll just say at the profile. I'll just run this in only local profile. I don't want that to be, sorry, this should be only local profile, not local. And what this is doing is it is creating some normal user, one admin user, and one inactive user to showcase how that looks. And moreover, another thing is the, okay, while I was talking, I just realized why the other thing was not working. The reason being, I think we had not given form login. So let me just quickly type that back. In fact, I'll just overwrite the method. Maybe. Okay. Authorize request. I'll just authorize all the requests and matches. Authenticated. Form login. Okay, I hope this should work. So all the endpoints, I'm telling that it should be authenticated and give me a form login. That is the reason why I guess that was the one. I'll just spin this up. So basically now what it will do is it will go ahead and create that schema in our database, which is user details. And yeah, so let's test that, how that looks. Okay. Okay, schema is created and data has been inserted. Uh, let me just query this back. Yeah, we have three roles, sorry, three users, two active, one inactive. Uh, let me see if that works. It should work. Yeah, so basically the form login was missing. The form login is not required for production, it is only for development purpose. But yeah, why that was not working, we can have that. So I have some users, which is Bruce, David, John. Let's start with the normal user. Let's say Bruce. uh, the password is pass, I guess. One sec, quickly. uh, yeah, all the passwords are pass. So yeah, it logs in, and the Bruce is has a role of user. So user endpoint is accessible, but if I'm trying to access the admin endpoint, it is still accessible. Why? Because uh, I haven't kept any role over here in my ant matcher, so that's fine. So as I said, you can have the endpoint, a specific endpoint specified with the role, uh, to have that RBAC over there. uh, I'll just log out from here, and try to log in with the inactive user which we have created, which is John, which is inactive. So let's say John, and password is pass. The user account is locked. So basically our logic, what we have written is over here in the user detail service, is one when it fetches, while converting, what we have done is, if it is inactive, so that activeness we have added to this. Account is expired, non-locked, credentials expired, is enabled. So you can have your database with comparative, like same number of columns what Spring requires, or you can have as many as you like, and map that business logic into these many. So basically login requires a login, business logic requires all this uh, parameters which can be computed from our end, which can be easily done in the service layer, which I just showed you. Okay, so this is all fine. So what we have covered till now is authentication using Spring Security. But the drawback over here is, as I said, uh, um, once the user logs in, uh, there's nothing called as like wherein, okay, I'll just log in with some user. Let's say John Pass. Okay, 1 second. I'm sorry, not John, David. Let's say David. Okay. Okay, so the idea here is when you log in, it is actually maintains this session um, uh, by using the J session ID. So what is the benefit of that J session ID? This J session ID, which it maintains in the browser, it is like uh, with the request, if once it sends back to the server, it uses that J session ID to go to that same instance. It is just like a sticky session. So but in our microservice world, what happens is you will have different instances for same service. Let's say you will have user service running as a 2 instance. So it's not necessary that you will just bypass all the requests to the same instance every time. And if at all, if it goes into another instance, it should not ask the user for authentication again, or authorization later when we'll be covering it. So when this comes into picture, the best way to do is to have a stateless session. Basically, once the request comes into the instance in the service, it is authenticated. There should be some means of some way to identify the user has been authenticated and let the user access the endpoint. There should be some way. So the way to do that is by giving some token. So it is just like give a token once the user is authenticated, and once the user comes back with the same token, the server checks whether the token is correct or not. And if the token is correct, the user is been given access to the endpoint. So jot comes into the picture, which is like JWT, which I pronounce it as jot, which is JSON web token. uh, so what essentially that needs to be done is, once the user has been authenticated, we need to create that jot token and provide it back to the user. So how that jot token looks like is, you can look it over here, which is jot.io. This basically gives us information. So it is separated into 3 sections, which is the header, payload, and verify signature. The signature which has been signed by the server. The header is the information which tells the signing uh, uh, um, approach which has been used. The payload is the information of the user. We have liberty to add as many information as like, but it shouldn't be any um, sensitive information that should be exposed, because it can be easily decoded. But the very important part here is the signature. So once you, whilst doing a signature, while you're signing that token, uh, we have to use a secret key. So, and that secret key is only available on the server side. So to showcase that how that looks, what we can do is I'll just remove this. So this is clear. So I'll just remove this HTTP security because we don't need that now, because we need to have a stateless session now. Uh, so that's the filter what I need. And so what this HTTP security filter is telling me that authorize the request, and I want to authenticate. So basically I don't want everything to be authorized, because I have exposed an endpoint over here, which is essentially, I'll just uncomment this. So this is the endpoint. So basically just imagine you have an UI, you are hitting this slash authenticate with some username and password, and you want to check if the user is legit or not. And if it is legit, you want to return that user with an JOT token, and which is auth response, which will be wrapped up in with a JOT token. So that's an idea. So but when you're calling this endpoint, you don't want the filter to block this endpoint, because that's not authenticated. That's the first time. So what I've done here is, in the filter, so the only way to bypass that is, in the filter you can specify uh, that and match of slash authenticate permitted, and rest of the any of the request you need to ensure that it is authenticated. And as I said, the whole idea for using JOT was uh, becoming a stateless. So even if this request goes to another microservice, same microservice, different instance, no matter where it is going, it should be authenticated. So that should be stateless, and we'll add a filter over here wherein you need to verify if that token is legit or not. So for that, what I can do is, I've created one more thing, is the JOT helper. That helper is basically, okay, yeah. So this helper, what essentially does is, it creates the token, verifies the token, generates the token. All that information is into this helper method, which we can easily use it. The most important one is the generate token. So how we are doing the token in our application right now is, we are using the username, which we will eventually get, like once the user is coming for authentication, we'll verify whether the user is authenticated. If it is authenticated, we get that user information from the database, and that information will be passed on to this method, which eventually it will go to the create token. And okay, before that we need to add a library for JOT, which is this one. I'll just, sorry, any question, anyone? Okay, I guess. Okay, so I have enabled this JSON Web Token library. So that will help us get that all the uh, thing getting done. So I've set up the subject. Subject is nothing but, for now, it is just a username for me.
Rohit,
Yeah.
I would like to ask one more thing there. If we want to encrypt the password, so how can we achieve using the Spring security?
Yeah. So right now, what you can do is, like, you can have self-signed certificate, and using that self-signed certificate, you can encrypt the password, definitely. And you can specify that in the, like, right now you have the password encoder over there. So one sec, where was that? Yeah. So this password encoder comes with different implementations. So the thing what you want to find out, it should be from this one. That should be great, because, or else you can uh, give your own implementation with the interface which password encoder is given out, and then you can pass on that information when it can be helpful for Spring to encode and decode it. But password encoder is important. It by default looks for that bean.
Okay, okay, okay.
So this one is coming from Spring Security itself. So if you just open up the the password encoder factories, so
Mhm.
you'll get that information.
Okay. It means what we have done in this project. So we have hard coded in the code, or we have to get the username password from the database so that we can encrypt, right?
Yeah, so now right now what I've done is I've just done it from a local populator. Now just
Uh-huh.
imagine there is a registration form wherein user is entering first name, last name, username, password, and submitting. That information is given to register endpoint. Okay,
Okay.
that register endpoint should, before it is pushing that information to the database, you will simply encode it this way, wherein I have just auto wired the password encoder
Uh-huh.
and I'm encoding with this one. So it is, if I show it in the database how that looks, the password would be, it is using bcrypt, it shows here. So if it is md5 sha512, all this information would be it will be
It's
shown in the,
already decrypted, right? Means it's encrypted and it will kept into the database.
yes, yes.
Okay, okay,
So
okay, fine.
while verifying, spring will decode it,
Mhm,
verify it, and just
mhm,
move on.
mhm. Fine,
And
fine.
if we are not using it, it will throw an error. So it is mandatory to use the encoder right now. Approach
Coder,
can be anything, but it is mandatory going ahead in spring 5. Okay.
fine, fine.
Okay. uh, so where was I? I'm sorry. uh, I'm lost. One second. uh, okay, maybe. Okay, yeah, I was in the token. So this for creating the token right now, I'm just using the username. As you've seen over here, it has a lot of other information as well, but for now username is fine for now. And issued at, this information we need to specify that what is the time when it was been issued. The expiration time, I have set it to like 10 hours. You can set it to whatever time you like, maybe 1 hour. It's your choice over there. And you want to sign this. Now how you want to signing by hs256 signature algorithm, and there's one secret key which is only available with the server. And this secret is the most secret key in the world, which has string as secret. So you can use the more uh, correct way of writing but the idea here is to have the correct way to create the token. uh, in the ideal world, like in the other larger project like enterprise projects, what happen is the secret information itself is not in the part of the login module or this microservice. That itself comes as a part of another service which will give me this information in an encrypted format. So the basic idea here is the secret should be used. So that's the one. So once we have created the token, we can, once we have it in the endpoint. So if I show that endpoint here, okay. So yeah, so before I go ahead, so I'm here, I have received the username and password. What I'll be doing is using the authentication manager. Now if you remember, in the authentication manager builder we specified that use the user detail service, which internally I am talking to the database, fetching the information and giving that object to spring, which is essentially this one, user details, which is a spring bean end of the day. Okay, so now doing that way, what will happen here is it will be authenticated. I just need to pass the username and password what the user is giving me, and internally what it will do is it will internally go ahead and call the user detail service, fetch the data, verify it with the database, and uh, give us the correct output. If there is any mismatch, there would be an exception thrown, and that exception I've just wrapped it right now in runtime exception, but you can have more meaningful exception over there. Let's say authentication, actual authentication exception, or login exception, something, a custom exception over there which extends runtime exception. For now I'm just throwing this. So if this bit is completed, that means the user is authenticated. Now once the user has been authenticated, the way to tell the user is to provide with the token. Now how we can provide that with, user with a token? We'll use the same login detail service which we had created and given it to Authentication Manager, and fetch the user by username, which I'll get the user details. And from that user details, what I'll do is I'll call the jot helper, which will generate the token for me, which I just explained you right now. So this will create the token, and that token should be wrapped in the auth response, and that should be given as a response to the user. Now just imagine your web application or mobile application, when you're logging in, you have this authenticate endpoint been called with the username and password. It has been authenticated and a token is being given out, and that token will be used in the subsequent calls. Okay, so this endpoint is clear. I need to enable something. So there should be a way. Actually, we need a filter over here. So why we need a filter? The filter basically what it does is you are giving out the uh, you're giving out the jot token, but once the user sends back that jot token to access some other endpoint, there should be a way to verify. How will you verify? Before entering into the resource or a controller, it should be verified. So the only way to verify that way is using the jot request filter. What is a custom filter? Eventually it is using once per request filter, which is another abstract class. Oops. Okay, yeah. So that's one other abstract class which is being used, and there's one method which we need to override, that's do filter internal. Now what this does is it does the our own business logic here. What I'll do is I'll check in my request whether there is an header called as authorization, get that header, strip out the the jot token from there, which is like get out the bare space value from there and just take the jot token. And with the help of jot helper which I've just created, it can extract the username, because while creating the jot token we had passed on the username to be used while creating. So I'll get the username extracted from that token, which is basically this method, get the subject. uh, Once I have that username, what I'll do is once we have that username, I'll go again into the login details service, get that user details. Okay, I have that user details. Now I'll validate that token to check if that token is valid. And what this will do is essentially it will check if the user is correctly available in the database and it has actually been signed by the server itself with the same secret key, and if the token is not expired. All that details will be done over here, and it will just move on with the next set of filters in the chain to access. So this bit is been enabled right now. So what we have right now is all in place. If I spin this up now, it should I should be able to access it via endpoint. uh, okay, let me quickly check if this is correct. Okay, and rest of the endpoints, so all these endpoints would be protected. So let me just spin this up again. Okay, so that's the user being created. Let me just hit an endpoint. I don't need this now. I'll just use the, I think I already have that one. One sec. Authenticate. So that's the endpoint, and David, user, and pass. Let me just run this. Okay, here we have the token now. If I just take this token and check how this looks like, as I said, we can verify it from that jot.io. So that's jot.io. So the user was David. If you will verify it over here, so that's the subject David which we had used, and expiration time and all this information. The signing capability, you can't check that because that information is blank, so it will ask to provide that correct signing capability, so you'll get that token correctly. So there's no way you can actually break this token to intrude into the service. So that is the only way we can access the application. So the benefit over here is, now just imagine this. Okay, in the next session, today was supposed to take the session on the API gateway as well, but I've moved it to the next week. But just imagine in the API gateway, you'll have all this information in one jar, which is pb-security config. And this one, you have a choice whether you want to keep this in the API gateway, which is the best part, you can keep it, or you can keep it in the individual microservices, wherein you will enable those filters to have enable this specific filter to verify the token if it is correct or not, and which will be communicating with the backend. Maybe it will maybe a downstream service, or it can be a same database with different microservice. It is, the choice is up to you depending upon the implementation. So that will be moved eventually over there. So using this token now, I can easily access the endpoint. Now the other endpoint, as I said, was this one. I'll just place this token here and try this user, which was one of our user. So yeah, so that's the endpoint. If I want to access the admin, I can access the admin. And if I'm not passing the token, it's giving me 403 access denied. Okay, that's clear. uh, Now the one other thing which I wanted to pass on is like one for the user which has been inactive, which was John. Let me try to log in using that user. So that's John, password is this. Authenticate, give me error, user account is locked. That's the information, and this message is basically coming from here, wherein I specified in the login resource, not login resource, login, yeah, yeah. So Spring internally, it is checking if the account locked is true, it is giving that information. Or if the user is not available, let's say uh, some gibberish username something. Let's see how that works. So user not found, that message is the custom message which is coming from here. Okay, so this helps in most of the application right now, wherein you are using the Spring security with the jot right now. uh, I'll give you a brief walkthrough of how OAuth works. Practically won't be possible for me to cover in one session, but definitely I'll give you a understanding how that is done, and will actually not create the authorization server or the resource server, which actually it involves three or four different microservices wherein it will communicate with each other. Rather than doing that, I'll give you a walkthrough how that works technically, and will integrate our login mechanism with GitHub. So let me just first give you a walkthrough of OAuth to how that works. I have a small slide which I've created. I'll just share that with you. Yeah. Okay. So the main, there are different actors in this actors involved in this OAuth 2. The one is the client, which wants to access a protected resource. Let's take an example. Um, let's say you want to access a particular file. Let's say say I've shared you a document, but I haven't given you permission to check that in the Google Drive. So that's a protected resource over here. And if I want to access, the client will ask the authorization server that it wants to access this protected resource. But since it's not able to verify if it is correct or not, what it will do is it will ask the resource owner. Resource owner is someone who is the owner of this protected resource. It asks if the permission should be given to the client. If it is yes, then the authorization server sends the authorization token to the client, which is short-lived token, to to verify, hey, you had requested me for an access to that protected resource, are you still alive? So that sends one authorization code token to the client. The client responds back, yes, I want that access. Once it gets the response from the client, make sure that, do remember that this token, the authorization token, is very short-lived. The client should respond immediately. It is unlike the other access token or jot token, which is like applicable for 1 hour. It's not. So once the client responds, the authorization server gives the access token, and then the client gets access to the protected resource using that access token. So these are the different components which needs to be built if you want to actually demonstrate OAuth. The best way to have it here is that you have the authorization server, the resource, everything, all available in GitHub, Facebook, Google. You can use this authentication mechanism to leverage that. Ideally, okay, ideally, OAuth 2 was only responsible for authorization, not for authentication. Uh, that as I shown you in this example, the client wanted to access the resource. It was asking for the permission rather than getting it authenticated. But in the days coming, what has happened is that the trusted resources like Google, Facebook are more are trusted, and they have readily available, wherein the user is already genuine and verified. So the third party applications can definitely easily integrate that as the part of authentication over there, wherein they don't need to take an overhead of developing an authorization server, resource server, all those things. So there is a small link which I'll share you if you want to look at this in building up the authorization server, resource server, all this thing. So you can definitely check this link out. I'll be sharing the code on this branch once it is ready. But for now, I'll just giving you a brief walkthrough of how that is done. Uh, Now I'll integrate this thing with the GitHub. You can definitely do it with the Facebook or Google. I'll integrate that and let's see how that looks. For that, I'll just the one thing what you need to do is you need to log into GitHub and you need to create your app. Suppose you are the owner of your app. So what you need to do is you have to create an app with some settings. There's some settings which you need to do. I think I already have created. So in the settings, you have the developer settings, and in the developer settings, there's an OAuth app. So I already have an app over here. You can create a new OAuth app with the application name, the homepage URL. So basically, if you check the homepage URL here, so that's the local. In the production environment, how that will be, it will be the actual host name wherein you want to uh, navigate the user back. So essentially, what does that mean? Once the user has been authorized, where you want the user to be taken back, it should have its own homepage. So basically, no, just skip this part a bit because we are just covering the authentication. So you can use the OAuth, how we can use the OAuth in getting the user authenticated. So you're coming back to the client and the callback URL where it should land. So that information you need to specify, and that's it. Application name, homepage URL, and authorization callback URL. those are the information what you just need to specify, and that information is pretty much used in the settings. I'll just revert my code because I think I had committed that, the small little settings which you need to do. Okay, one sec. Okay. Okay. I'll just revert everything. Okay. Yeah. So that's the information what you need to go. So you have the client ID, the client secret from the settings, what I just shown you, which I picked it up over here, which is developer settings. Once I created that app, I found this client ID and the client secret, added it over here. And this information, again, it is coming from the properties, which I sent you last time, the application properties, which you can access from here. All the properties which you can access. And then once I've added this and pretty much it, know the settings, mostly I've disabled everything. As you can see, they are not components anymore, even the filter, nothing. So everything is there, but they are not working because all that has been disabled. The only thing that can work right now is via the property what I've set for OAuth to client. If I spin this up, and now just imagine on your home page, when you once you land on the home page and you specify that you want to log in with Google or GitHub or Facebook. I'm using GitHub right now because I'm not there on the Facebook, but you can definitely use that information. So this bit will be there in the developer section, developer documentation for Facebook. You will get this information. So once I spin this up, it should help me to navigate to GitHub and get it authorized. Okay, 9001. I won't do it here because I'm already logged in into GitHub. I don't want to log out. I'll just go into incognito and localhost 9001. Okay, sorry, my context path is auth. Okay, now this has navigated to me to GitHub because I'll just show that it will be better if you have a look over here. So localhost 9001 auth. So what this essentially did is it called the authorization URL, which is essentially the GitHub login. It checked authorized. It called up the authorization URL, which is part of the GitHub login OAuth. In return, it got the response that, hey, I want to access. So in return, what it did was it specified the client ID where to which app the user is trying to log in, and it came up with the screen. So now if the user wants to log in, he can just pass on that information and sign in. And I want to access this application. Now, for instance, if you're creating an app, which is, let's say, a Swiggy or Food Panda, something, so that app should be registered in GitHub or Facebook or Google for them to know that this user is trying to access this, the application what the user has created. Once I sign in, it will be authenticated using the GitHub URL, and once it is successful, it is back. It is authenticated, and it is back onto this page. Now I can access any of the resource I like on my endpoint. Okay, yeah. So pretty much it. I've covered everything. Right now, all this information is in login service. Ideally speaking, what will happen? I wanted to demonstrate because login is something which people have been writing all like spending too much time writing the code because of the business logic rather than giving control to the Spring. You just need to have all the business logic in your service layer, which is the login user details. Any complex login business logic is the you can compute over there, and in return you should give this information, and may it be any application in the world, you will have this information for login, which is username, password, is the account expired, is the account locked, is the credential expired, and is the user enabled. This is enough for any application to get authenticated. And if the user is authenticated and if the password is about to expire, you can have another API call wherein you can fetch the user information, user profile, which actually is not returning this pojo, it will be returning this one, which can be extended, but basically from the database end. So it is up to the user to decide. And the token bit, the filter, what I just added over here, this one essentially will be part of, as I said, either will be part of API gateway, which will be in the next session. I'll be moving this into the API gateway and how we can communicate with the different services. uh, or you can add it as a library or jar file into every microservice, wherein uh, that filter will be responsible to validate the user. It makes sense if you keep that in the API gateway, because that's an entry point, and if you want to validate whether the user is correct or not with the correct token, and if it is, then proceed to the correct microservice where it needs to be routed, else just throw the user back from the API gateway. API gateway will be covering in the next lecture. So yeah, that's it for this session. Anyone, any questions? By the way, the code has been committed. uh, I'll be committing the code for OAuth 2 as well, the resource server, the authorization server, the demo one. If you want to contribute, you can definitely go ahead. Okay. Any questions, anyone? I guess no.
Um, Hey Rohit, Devasys here.
Yeah, hi.
Rohit, actually, my question is not related to this context, only context to microservices.
Yeah, sure.
So actually, on other day I have a discussion with an interviewer. So like microservices, we have a service called Service A, and we have called another service Service B.
Mhm,
So like Service A used to call Service B to complete the work.
mhm,
So but meanwhile, Service A to do some DB transactions.
mhm,
So and again, Service B also need to do some DB transactions.
mhm,
So the question was like if the service A while doing the DB transaction it
mhm,
got failed, means some DB error happen or transaction error happen.
mhm,
Still we're calling service B. So
mhm.
how to handle this scenario? Like it will call the service B, or it and service B will be doing to the complete the transactions. That the things actually.
S- yeah, so there are two aspects over here. In a way, if one is getting failed, then another one has to have some kind of a data. In the database you need to have some record wherein it says that this is this record is there, but the corresponding parent record is not there. So some scheduler will take care that it will wipe out that, because it is not possible to roll back. The another way is, you if you have any such kind of complex logic wherein you have 3 or 4 services that needs to be called upon to have one flow completed, you can have an orchestration layer. So just imagine, for instance, just imagine like I'll just add. So imagine if you have an API gateway layer. You have an API gateway. This is an API gateway layer, and this API gateway will internally call based on the endpoint what you have. Based on it, will be calling this uh, the orchestration layer, and uh, orchestration layer. What this does is it is aware that it needs to call different microservices, because it doesn't make sense for a UI layer to call so many microservices, which tends to slow down the performance sometimes. So it will call the multiple microservices. And this one, what you can do is in the orchestration layer, you will wrap, oops, in the orchestration layer, you will wrap it into the transactional. Okay. And if this is getting failed, you will just not proceed. Like you will tend to roll back. So there in transactional, you have something called as propagation, and you can specify whether you want to stop that transaction or you want to roll back the previous transactions which are already committed. So within that @transactional, you have something called as propagation. If you explore that, you can have that question answered for you. But orchestration layer is the one which needs to be there, rather than UI calling different like multiple APIs. Rather than call one API, let them, just like GraphQL layer, the way GraphQL works.
So actually, I'm a bit confused. This orchestration layer, it will be like means this layer will be having all the means code, means it is how it will behave like DO or.
It will be another microservice, and in the DAO layer, it will be calling all the downstream services.
Acha, okay, okay, yeah, I understood. Yeah, because I have not much exposure. I'm just learning that microservice from Udemy, so I trapped there.
Uh,
So that's
no,
what. Mm.
so whenever there are usually orchestration level, you won't find it because uh, you will find an concept of orchestration layer when a legacy application is being moved into microservice, but still you have a lot of API calls been done from the UI end. Rather, UI wants only one API call and give me that information. It is redundant if I call M1, take the output and give it to M2, because I'm not getting benefit from M1's output. What am I going to do? Like the UI is not going to do anything. It's worth if orchestration layer takes that bit, because it's the
Yeah.
network flow is also there, comes into picture.
Understood, understood, understood. Thank you so much. Yeah. So if M1 got fail, like I spoke with like something we have fault tolerance, right? So
Mm,
if I told like if M1 is calling to
mm,
M2 to do the job, and if M1 also failed,
mm.
M2 will let we do the M2 do the all the jobs, and we'll be sending a message to response to the M1, and M1 will have like some generic message.
Yeah,
We'll attach that and we can send that.
right.
That
uh, yeah, right. And as you said, fault tolerance, I'll take one bit, because in my previous project, what we used to do is, like, in this M1, suppose you had the database connectivity, one, like you were talking to the database, for instance. Now if there is some issues, let's say network is down, or let's say something is gone wrong, so you can use the retry over here, Spring's retryable. What
spring.
it will essentially do is it will keep retrying at least for 5 times. Okay.
Okay.
Of you can specify the number of times you want that to be retried, but if that is so important, you can retry that, or you can use the historics, wherein you can use the fallback method within the same microservice, which we will be covering in the next session. That this one has to fall back. So basically what it will do is, just imagine, now if it is not able to get the information from traditional MySQL or any conventional database, what it will do is it will go to Redis or Mongo, or um, any of the NoSQL database, and get the last stored response. So at least the microservice is responding with some information rather than failing it out. So these are some of the fault tolerance approach that can be used: the retriable thing, and sending the cache data in case the APIs are failing.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Understood. Thank you so much.
yeah. Anyone, anything else? I was supposed to give a walkthrough of the API gateway as well, but time doesn't permit. But next time I'll do that. It's worth I do the coding and give you a walkthrough, which I'll be doing in the next session as well, and I can answer many questions. Uh, and yeah, next time I'll go ahead with that. And do let me know if there is anything else, if that needs to be taken as part of session. If you want any data, guys, if you are interested in Spark, we can do that as well, by using Java and Spark. If you're interested, once this is completed, because next session probably is the next and last session, and if if it is required, if anyone is interested in Spark, we can go ahead with those sessions as well.
Thanks, Rohit. Probably we are actually trying and planning that June is a month for Spark and Scala Hadoop. There is another team that is preparing that. So we'll try and precipitate that, and we might be having next tech of the month focused on those technologies. Apart from that, guys, if you have any questions, it'll really help if you ask here, because these sessions are being organized for your own benefit. So make the best use of it. Anyone has any questions, any suggestions?
Rohit, Naveen here from Bangalore office.
Yeah.
So, with respect to Spring Security, with authenticating or authorizing with JWT token, is there any way we can handle the multi-tenancy? I mean, multiple data source.
Multiple data source.
Database.
Oh yeah. So you're talking for the global transaction.
Suppose you are authenticating the user from one particular database. So if what if we have a multiple database? So how do we can handle that one too? But we need to provide one more layer where each and every call would do some authentication, which database to look for which user.
So yeah, so in that way, I think it's very legacy way that you're talking about. What we can do is here, you can have another microservice wherein that is responsible for collecting the information or verifying. It can be like a postman, like you're giving this information, hey, here's my username and password, get this authenticated. So that microservice is responsible. Now if you have different multiple data source, for instance, it's not necessary that this user is lying in one database one, it would be in database 5. So in that different microservice, you will have the global transaction implemented, wherein you will talk to the different database and get that information if the user is valid or not, or if it is whatever information is there. So it's worth if we keep it in different microservice and have that global transaction implemented in different microservice. But this should be the entry point, the login user details, because this has to be like this method. The output of this method is been fed to the Spring Security. So no matter what you do, I'm calling the repository, which is talking to my database. You can call the downstream service using the web client and get that information. It can be a text file or anything. It's up to the implementation.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Nilam, I'm done. Yeah.
Great, guys. Thank you so much.
Rohit,
I think one more question. Yeah.
Yeah.
This session is being recorded, right?
Oh yeah.
Yes, Shankacharya.
Please share across our mail so we can refer through
I
this.
hope you received. Last time you had sent me a mail or a message, and I had sent you specifically this recording separately as well. I hope you had received, right?
Attachment I didn't receive.
It's never in the attachment. It's the URL that's mentioned in the content. If you see, there is a highlighted hyperlink in the mail that directs you to the Google location. We cannot attach that bigger recording in the mail. So it's always on the Google Drive and you can access it there.
Yeah, sure. That is there, nothing to.
And the code has been committed to GitHub as well. I'm not getting much time, but yes, if someone wants to contribute over here, I mean, they want to split, add some more microservice, because that will be beneficial for the API gateway session, which will be the next week. So you can do access that and contribute on this GitHub as well.
Sure.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.